Hey, I'm James from Smoking At Barbecue, and some say if you're trimming your brisket, you're wasting your time. Today, we're gonna find out. So for today's experiment, I picked up two as close to identical looking briskets as I could find, and they mirror each other almost in look, shape, dimensions, and weight. The weight was within a couple tenths of a pound, so it's about 97.5% in terms of when I checked it out on the scale. So I'm gonna be using my 7-7-14 method for smoking these briskets. I'll explain that in a chapter down below. But first, I want to go into the three main rules, or the most common rules that you hear from famous pitmasters around the world and people who own restaurants in terms of what's behind their trim methodology, and then find out which of these three rules might be great if you own a restaurant, but they don't necessarily apply to what we're doing in our backyard, and answer the question, are we wasting our time with a trim, or are we actually getting a better result?
Make it good. If it's not good, don't cook it.
So let's go through the three most common rules that I've summarized based off of listening to countless interviews with world famous pitmasters. So those three in no particular order are consistency, quality, as well as repurposing for other products. So starting with quality, this is if you waited in line for 5 hours to get a world-renowned brisket and your slice just happens to come on the plate and it is 90% melted fat, you're not going to be incredibly happy. And this creates a bit of a customer service disaster. So the frontline staff are slicing very quickly, and restaurants are all about turning over, get you in, get you out, and keep you really happy. And so if you've not been careful with your trim, you're potentially creating the opportunity for something to come that doesn't meet customers' expectations, whether it's, as I mentioned, all fat, or if it's overdone and completely dry. This is not going to be the type of experience. So that's quality. Second relates right into this, which is the consistency. And this applies also, as I mentioned, for customer service, but the angle that I'm putting here is on the staff cooking. Not everyone like home where it's you cooking your brisket from start to finish. There's shifts, there's turnovers, people start, people finish, and there's staff handling briskets in between. And so, for example, if we weren't to do anything with a brisket, I see sometimes flats go taper all the way down to about 1/2 inch thick. You've got other flats that are 1.5 inches thick. And if you've got a shift change halfway through your cook and you've got all these different thickness flats on your smoker, the staff coming in aren't going to know where's my 1/2 inch flats, where's my 1.5 inch flats, and potentially things are going to burn, or you're going to be constantly opening your pits. And if you're looking, you ain't cooking. This is going to really slow things down. So this causes a number of problems. And the consistency also helps address point number one, which is the quality of the product. And third is the repurposing and using that. So if we were to cook a bunch of briskets with really thin flats and they were to burn, as I mentioned, this is now garbage. This is discarded. It's lost to the board. But even as unideal as it might be in brisket form, everything that they trim goes into a grind, either for things like burgers, sausages, you name it. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do. Extra large globs of fat can be rendered into tallow. So in a restaurant setting, nothing that you trim off, and as crazy as it might be to take a 14-pound brisket like the two that I picked up today and trim them down to 12 to 10 pounds, this is not lost, and this is serving another use and creating other products that the restaurant needs. So today I want to find out which of these three rules apply and translate just as well to the backyard using my 7-7-14 method. Let me tell you a little bit more about the game plan for today's cook. I should mention all the way that not all restaurants agree, particularly with the Texas trim technique, which is largely behind these three rules. I watched a video that my friend Al from Eat More Vegans did when he visited one of the country's best-selling pastrami restaurants in New York. And here's a quick little clip where they shared that they don't trim at all.
Time to get the brisket out and trim. I suck at trimming brisket. I hate trimming brisket.
But you know what? For today, there is no trimming.
No trimming?
No
Nothing?
trimming. No trimming.
So when I'm spending an hour and a half trimming a brisket, this should take me 15 minutes?
This is not Texas. This is Brooklyn.
Guys, I don't have to trim the brisket anymore.
Now you might think my friend Al is a little bit too excited about the prospect of not trimming, but I can assure you, after he did that video, I had him over here for our house and we were doing a brisket to brisket bake-off using my Kamado Joe versus a big green egg, and we trimmed some brisket side by side. And sorry Al, but I can see you're not kidding here. The struggle was real. So method. So I'm gonna do a couple small differences between these two briskets, but I also wanna keep them generally as similar as possible so we could really focus on the three rules that we wanna find out what applies to a backyard cook versus what maybe makes more sense in the restaurant. So the two briskets, I got them out the day before. I got them out of the package, patted them dry, and we're gonna do an overnight salt dry brine. I know that this absolutely makes a definitive difference in the quality of brisket, and so I'm gonna do this the same. Now, salt does not penetrate fat, so I'll be curious to find out if the brisket that we don't trim and we put that salt on a thicker fat cap or on the bottom where we've got large globs of fat, if this is going to make any difference or not. For the brisket that I'm gonna trim, the total trim time here was about 10 minutes. So if you were to not trim versus trim, the time savings is 10 minutes. The second thing that I'm going to do is save some of the fat that I do take off and the meat for my burger grind, but I'm also gonna render the fat down into my homemade tallow. Now, I recently did an experiment between Wagyu beef tallow and my own tallow, and we couldn't tell any difference when it comes to flavor. So for my backyard barbecue brisket that I'm gonna do the trim, I'm going to inject that with tallow. For the keep it easy route, I'm gonna use, since I have a little bit of leftover Wagyu tallow, and do the common method that you see in some other videos where you just get a bit of a scoop and put that in the butcher's paper when we go ahead and wrap it. Otherwise, everything else is going to be the same. I'm gonna use a little bit of my leftover Franklin barbecue rub. I ran out of Lowry's and I found that the Franklin barbecue rub is almost essentially Lowry. So the flavor profile is going to be almost identical, and the only extra ingredient that I'll add is using my pepper cannon to grind up a little bit of pepper. When I was trimming my brisket, the common areas that I focus in, first on the bottom, is removing some of that easy to get silver skin or stringy fats so that I have a better surface to work with when applying my rub. The second area that I like to focus in on is on the mohawk. So right over on the top, we've got this protruding mohawk, and the argument here is that this is just going to burn up in our smoker and it's not going to be a good product. So following that trim guidance, I'm gonna remove that and put that in my burger grind pile. And then coming back to the bottom side, we've got a large piece of the decal on the bottom that is just hard fat. Like when it's cold out of the refrigerator, it's almost like hard fat. And the argument here is that this won't render. So those are the three areas that I focused in on for my trim, which is again following general rules of the Texas trim, with the top fat cap going down to about a 1/4 inch thick. I'm really curious to see on the on-trim brisket if we burn the top, like the argument is, that if the flat not being trimmed to a uniform thickness is dry and burns, and the bottom, that decal where everyone says this won't render, that it does render or doesn't render, and we get something maybe less desirable in terms of our slices. So what's this 7-7-14 method? So this is a combination of a bunch of different things that I've tried, and it's just been absolutely turning out a great result. So it was inspired by Terry Black's, where he shares a method that they smoke their briskets the day before, wrap them in the refrigerator, and then actually finish that cook the next day. This is to help reduce the time in terms of the actual day of turning over a brisket for service, but as well the argument is that being wrapped overnight in the refrigerator locks in some smoke. I found this didn't really improve the smoke level that much, and the idea of, again, getting your brisket, cooking it, cooling it, and then reheating it the next day, I liked some of the idea and the thinking behind this, but I just didn't find it that practical to apply at home. Another common best practice that I've been borrowing more of lately is the long hot hold. Every restaurant in Texas shares in different level of interviews that they're actually finishing their briskets often 11 to 17 hours beforehand. And I started experimenting with this earlier in the year when I tried to do a manual hot hold in my Kamado Joe by turning the vents down, and I was able to carry that 11 hours. This worked really well, but because I was doing it manual, you have to sort of guess where those temperatures are and have a lot of trust that something doesn't go horribly wrong. And so instead, a temperature controller at 150 degrees is the best way to do that. So you can either do that in a grill if you have a temperature controller or in your oven. I was going to do this using the iCommand, since that's what I have installed on my Big Joe Series 1, but after July long weekend, it's been turned into a brick and I couldn't use it. I have 4 other temperature controllers that I'm going to be testing this summer, but I've not used any of them, and I don't want to put, for me, local currency, 2 briskets at $160 worth of brisket in a grill with no experience on the temperature controller. So instead, I've adjusted my oven using the manual settings where you can make adjustments to your temperature up or down so I can get that to hold 150 degrees Fahrenheit. I brought it down 20 degrees because the lowest temperature I can go is 170. And after tracking with my Inkbird probe, I saw it was still reading a little bit higher. So after a few hours, I bumped that down a little bit more to get it exactly at 150 degrees. So coming back to what is the 777 method? Well, based off of all of these learnings and best practices, there's no argument. The best smoke that I can get is coming off of my offset, but the downside here is it's a lot more work. But using a method shared by Jerby, I'll show you the sort of the cabin style fire that I'm building in my offset, I get a consistent 1 hour of temperature at around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature gauge on the dial stays pegged 250 to max 270. Get a little bit more variability. I'll show you the meter chart, and I did pretty well staying within a tight 20 degree range until one of the splits that I left in my fire chamber to dry out actually combusted and shot my temperature up around the 4 hour mark. But otherwise, this is really, really simple because at 7 hours, I'm building 7 fires, and I'll show you the exact fire configuration that I'm building. It was the same each time, and like clockwork, it was running an hour. So that gives us the first stage of smoke. 7 hours is about as much smoke that our briskets are going to take on. After that, my offset is just going to take longer. If I wrap it in paper, if I wrap it in foil, we're not really going to be getting a lot more smoke flavor unless we were to leave it exposed the whole time and go for a crunchier bark. So for the next 7 hours, I set up my Kamado Joe Indirect. You won't need to go anything fancy, double indirect or any of those other settings. We just want nice, gentle heat. And this is really helping target making sure that we render the fat inside. If we do a brisket too hot, too quick, and you see a slice and you see white fat, this is a brisket that hasn't properly rendered either the fat cap or some of that intermuscular fat. And since we're doing an untrimmed brisket, I want to go for gentle heat. So I started off at about 225 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what I'm getting on the dome, and a little bit cooler, about 200 degrees is what I was seeing on the meter near the probe position being near the grate. And then I bumped that up after a couple hours because it was starting to get late in the night, and I wanted to have my work back schedule for stage 3 of my 7714 method, which is in the oven at 150 degrees. So that's it. So 7 hours on the offset for the great smoke. And again, this is easy. If you never ran an offset before using this fire method, like I'm using on my Smoke North here on Generation 2, this is really easy peasy. Anybody could do that. It's just set an alarm for 1 hour, throw that fire in there, and then go about your business for the rest of the day. You only have to do that 7 times. Then move to incredibly easy. This is near oven easy for indirect. Drop in our deflector plates, set our vents down to 1 finger and about 1/4 inch up top, and this is holding 225 degrees like clockwork until again I started to bump that up a little bit later, because that's when we got to 9 o'clock, 9:30 at night, and I want to move into my final 14 hours, which is in the oven at 150 degrees. And that'll bring us to current time when it's about time to get our briskets out, slice them up, and see how we did. These are incredibly tender, but let's try and get a weight here on first our untrimmed brisket. I think that's down to 8.15.6 pounds and ounces. So 8.15 and 6 ounces. That started at just over 14, I think 14.038. And our 14.4 original, our trimmed brisket, this is down to 7.06. So we definitely have not rendered out the equivalent of what we've trimmed. Let's get the camera repositioned and slice in for our taste test. So on your right is our untrimmed brisket, and on your left is our trimmed brisket. And just feeling these, oh, look at that jiggle. They look pretty good. Again, incredibly tender. I don't want to rip anything, but as I was reaching under, I can still feel some of that hard decal piece of fat. Like it felt almost as firm as it did when we were first getting it out of the package. So I'm curious to see if that shows up in our bite, but that was maybe an early clue. Get my Dow Strong offset slicer out. Let's go for, first of all, the cross section on each of our 2 briskets. So that looks really good. I'm not squeezing it all, but I don't see any white fat. We've got everything perfectly rendered, yellow squishy fat cap. That looks really good. Let's go over to our untrimmed, same spot. So nothing's white, but we definitely have, oh, maybe a little bit up here. This is That's a thick fat cap. So this is, again, we did not trim. And while that's squishy and yellow on the top, yellow on the sides here, actually that, I'm not sure if I waited 5 hours, I would want that on my plate as a big chunk, but we will see. Pretty well rendered all the way through. Let's take a look again on our lean side, or working towards our lean side. And again, this is stuff that I trimmed on our trim brisket, not here. But it actually feels pretty good on the bottom. That's not looking too bad right here. Okay, get a slice out of our point end for samples. I am going to come down to the very end of the flat and work our way up, because again, the argument would be that by not trimming this thin end is what was going to burn. So let's take a couple slices here right out of our flat. Doesn't look bad to me. We've got nice bark, rendered fat. Looks juicy. Again, just a little bit thicker than the 1/4 inch. That's still, even after cooking, above a 1/4 inch. That's maybe even more than a 1/2 inch of fat cap. So this definitely did not render, even with 7 hours in the offset, 7 hours in my Kamado, and 14 hours in the oven. There's still a pretty thick fat cap. Let's get a slice out of our trimmed brisket as well for our taste test, and we'll do the exact same thing on the flat end. Try and do this so you can see. So again, the argument here with the sort of the S slice is that this should not have any waste right on the end of our flat. And first slice, you can even see that 1/4 inch fat cap looks nice. It's just juices galore all through that. Nice smoke ring. I think that's pretty good. Maybe there's an argument to that. Okay, let's start with our flat from our on trim. It's a good flat. It's really good. Definitely didn't take that down to a 1/4 inch like normal, but no complaints here, because that fat cap is rendered beautifully and full of flavor. This is really good. Maybe we'll see if we have a bit more to notice up as we work our way up towards the point end. I'll go for the same second slice on our trimmed brisket. It's also really good. Okay, no difference on the very end of the flat. So I did pick 2 briskets. I try and avoid the paper thin ends, so maybe that's helping it here. It would be a bigger difference if we were going from a thick flat comparing to a paper thin flat, but really happy with these two. If anything, I actually like a little bit more than the 1/4 inch fat cap on this flat. Let's go for our point end. Get a little sample here. Cheers. This is a good day in the office, guys. It's really good. Again, that is, the fat is rendered well, but that is rich. Like again, when you have that much more sort of fat, I did pick a piece where I would have trimmed some had it been a trimmed brisket. But I don't mind that for one bite. If you were eating kind of a 1/2 pound to a pound, that could get rich quick, but that's always the case with the point end. Let's try our trim brisket. Taste-wise, they're identical. If anything, I sometimes prefer a little bit of that extra fat on our trimmed brisket. I have to say, like, if you were nervous, I'm comfortable trimming brisket, do it all the time. There was a week this spring where I did 7 or 8 briskets in the course of 7 to 10 days. There was a lot. So with more practice, trimming a brisket is not a big deal. I'm honestly blown away though, just how good the 0 effort brisket is, and in some cases, particularly the flat, where we didn't reduce it down to a 1/4 inch, I actually think I like it better. So I've got that off inside, and guests are diving in and enjoying right now, and kind of the same verdict. There's no difference between these two. So I definitely, if we put money on this at the beginning before doing it, I would have lost money. I would have thought the difference would be more pronounced in a negative way. I can definitely see for a restaurant where if you need to have sort of meat and fat for making sausages or burgers, then there's really no downside here. I can also see the consistency issue, that if you were producing 160 briskets at a time or something like that, which Franklin's is doing every single day, managing the different thickness flats would be a real problem. But here I didn't have that issue. If the top was starting to burn or the Or if my flat was starting to burn, I could put a foil cap on it, or just spray it with water, or move it around inside my smoker. I don't really have any hot spots, but just to make sure, I rotated the briskets at the 2-hour mark, sort of back and forth, just to make sure that they were both subjected to the exact same heat signature. And inside the Kamado, they were running within a degree of one another on the 2 meter probes. So I can definitely see all the pros, if you are a restaurant, that this actually solves some real problems. In the backyard, however, there's a couple things I like about the untrimmed brisket, particularly on the flat. I think from this point forward, no matter how thick the fat cap is on the lean, I'm just gonna leave it. I will do that S curve if I go down to paper thin, because I do save all of my trim, the meat, for burger grinds and things like that. So again, similar to a restaurant, I get that benefit. If you don't though, and you're just gonna throw it away, why not cook it? And if it turns out great, you've saved yourself from throwing away extra protein that you paid good money for. In terms of the point end, I definitely think taking the 30 seconds. So I mentioned that brisket trim, doing the bottom, the silver skin, the stringy bits, it all added up to about 10 minutes. I do think that thick piece of the bottom decal, that still makes, 20 seconds to slice that down or carve it a little bit thinner, so you don't quite get a little bit of that glob. Even though we were able to render it, it's just a little bit much too rich, if you will, almost on the point end of our brisket. So that's not a result that I expected. So will I continue to trim my briskets? Yes. But will I trim them the same way? No, I'm going to back it down to just the basics. Take what I need for my burger grind, reduce the obvious thick fat, but no stress if you don't have the time or energy, or you're a little bit worried about getting all those nitty-gritty details. They just don't show up in the bite when you taste them side by side. I also have to say, since I don't often do this, or not too often on video, I often, if I'm tasting something the same day that I've cooked it and your palate just gets overwhelmed with smoke, man, can you appreciate what you've made the day after. It's the next day, you've had a shower, your nose is clear, you're not standing beside, the offset or beside my Kamado and just inhaling that wonderful aroma of brisket and smoke all day. It is so good, even better than I expected, and even more reason I appreciate sort of this 7-7 method, where if you don't want to run an offset all day and you're a little bit worried about it, this makes an easy way to get all the benefit without being tied to it for the entire 14, 15, 16 hours or whatever that brisket would take to finish had we gone all the way, and it saves me the cost of the wood, as that's not always inexpensive depending on the sources that you have available to you. That's it for today though. I'm James with Smoking Dad Barbecue signing off. If you'd like to hang out and ask a question a bit more of a one-on-one basis, be sure to check out my member section. I go live once a month and we can hang out, answer any questions that you might have other than these pre-recorded videos. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe to catch the next video. I'll see you then. I'm James with Smoking Dad Barbecue signing off.